Good morning. If you will, go ahead and turn with me to Exodus chapter 1. That's where we're going to be this morning. And I would encourage everyone, we're going to be sitting in this passage for all morning. And we're going to be reading quite a bit of it. So I would encourage everyone to get your Bibles out and read along with me. I just want to say thank you to Matt for asking me to speak and the elders allowing me to speak. As you know, this year we're going through real people, real faith, real problems, finding Jesus in the story of the Old Testament. And Matt told me that this week is a pretty minor character. We don't have much about him. Moses. Literally a whole book, Exodus, the exit, is about Moses. Fortunately for all of us, we're not going to be here till 6 o'clock tonight, so we're not covering all of Moses. We're actually going to stop at the burning bush. So we're not going to go through the 10 plagues. We're not going to go through the Exodus, the crossing of the Red Sea. We're not going to go to Mount Sinai and the 10 Commandments. We're not doing the wilderness. We're not doing Moses' death. There's a lot of things that we just don't have time to do this morning. But we're going to do everything else, which is just the first 3 chapters of Exodus. And for us to start, I have a question. And the question is, what changes need to happen for us to be better ministers? What changes need to happen for us to be better ministers? Now keep that question in the back of your mind, because we're going to Exodus chapter 1, because the birth of Moses is Exodus chapter 2. But for us to know what's happening, we got to look at the context. So Exodus chapter 1, we're going to start in verse 7. Exodus chapter 1, starting in verse 7. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel, so they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and made their lives bitter with hard service, in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. So, the people of Israel at this time is measured to be somewhere around, a conservative number is around 1 million people. That's a lot of people. And Egypt, especially Pharaoh, was worried that Israel would rise up, they would rebel against Egypt, and that they would eventually leave. And all of the free labor that they used would leave with it. So they were harsh. I imagine Israelites being beaten with clubs and sticks, and the Egyptians maybe having whips, and they were slaves. And what's interesting about this is that the worse they were dealt with, the more offspring they had, which is the opposite of what the Egyptians wanted. They just kept growing and growing and growing. And that gets us to verse 15, Exodus 2:15. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as a midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, Why have you done this? And let the male children live. The midwives said to Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and gave birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because of the midwives feared God, he gave them families. All right, we're going to stop right there. So, there are lots of things I cannot imagine, but I can't imagine Pharaoh looking at these midwives and saying, hey, it's your job to help birth these children, and all of the little girls, we're going to let them live. And all of the little boys, as soon as they're born, you're going to kill them. And I have no idea how he wanted the midwives to kill them. I guess it doesn't matter, because they didn't do that. They didn't kill them. And they gave an excuse. Something interesting about these midwives is that Pharaoh talked to them directly, which usually Pharaoh didn't talk to common people directly, just as like a king wouldn't or something like that. So these midwives definitely had the respect of Pharaoh, or at least they were well known. Something else, verse 19, it says, The midwife said to Pharaoh, Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. That means that these midwives had knowledge of helping birth babies that were Egyptian and were Hebrew, because they knew the difference. So these are very well respected midwives. And they didn't kill the babies, and it says, So God dealt well with the midwives. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Now, that seems pretty insignificant, but if you were a midwife during this time, that probably means that you did not have a family of your own. That's who they picked to be midwives, because they could leave in the middle of the night or middle of the day and go birth all the babies that there were, 1 million people. And that gets us to verse 22. Now, this is probably the worst thing we will talk about today, verse 22. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Imagine in your family, there's a pregnancy, and all of the excitement and all of the joy that comes with that, and how ready you are to have this child, and you're in the middle of birthing this child, and you get to hold your son, and then maybe that day, maybe a few days later, maybe it's a month later, these soldiers from Pharaoh come in with their clubs and their whips, and they grab this baby. They don't hold this baby, they grab this baby. And they maybe stuff it into a sack, or throw it onto a wagon, and then they drive down to the Nile. Maybe it's just a day of that. Maybe they're going through town and they're picking up all the little baby boys, and they have these sacks full of babies or these wagons full of babies, and they go down to the Nile and they literally toss these babies into the river. Now, like I said, the people of Israel were about 1 million people. So let's say 1% of the population are baby boys, a very small percentage. That would still be 10,000 babies. 1% of 1 million is 10,000. So We're talking about a whole nation that's in sorrow, a whole nation that when they get pregnant, they're not excited, they're worried. And when they have a child and they see that it's a baby, they know that their baby is going to be tossed into the Nile River with crocodiles and predators and all sorts of things. And I've always thought about, Morgan and I don't have any children, but as a father, what it would be like for a group of men to come into my house and try to take my baby. I'm sure that there were some parents that were killed in this process that said, no, you're not going to take my baby. But then you have other kids that are left as orphans, and there's a culture that if you stand up, you're going to be killed. And where are the rest of your kids going to go? Where's the rest of your family going to go? So it was this culture of handing over your babies to be killed, to be thrown into the river. And that is the context of baby Moses. That is the context. That's what the nation of Israel is going through when we get to Exodus chapter 2. Exodus chapter 2, starting in verse 1. Now a man from the house of Levi went and took as his wife a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she took him for a basket, made of bulrushes and dabbed it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the riverbank. And the sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. So, we have Moses' mother who has experienced, all of her friends that have had children. She's seen all these babies thrown into the river, and she has hers, and she decides to hide it. Now, like I said, I don't have any children, but I would imagine that a crying baby is hard to hide. It's hard to conceal because the slaves, her husband would have had things to do and places to be, and her as a slave, she would have had duties and things to do and places to go. And it says, when she could hide him no longer, she took for him a basket made of bulrushes or papyrus. So, I don't know. I cannot imagine what it's like one night they're sitting around the fire and they've decided to make a basket. And she's sitting here weaving this basket back and forth, knowing that she's about to put her baby in this and put him in the river. And she would have had like a black tar substance to make it waterproof. And then she goes down to the river. We'll read that Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe at the river. And usually Egyptians bathed in the morning before the sun got hot. So there's a good chance that Moses' mother went down in darkness. And, something I can't imagine, placing your baby in the river, and at that point, leaving your other child to watch the baby, and you have to leave because probably the sun is coming up and you're about to get caught. But she places Moses in the river, and she leaves Miriam, his sister there. Going back to the scripture reading that was read before, Hebrews 11 says that this was done in faith. In faith, she placed Moses in the river. And I guess when I read Hebrews 11, all these people in faith, they did this in faith, in faith, in faith. I think of people that are confident. I think of people that are calm and collected. But I wonder how she felt in this moment. I wonder if it was a frantic mother. I wonder if it was a mother that felt like she had no other options. Or if it was, like I said, what I've always perceived as in faith meant, cool, calm, and collected, and fully trusting. And that's one of those things we'll never know. We will never know how she fully felt. And something else that I've always wondered was how much calculation was put into this. Did she know Pharaoh's daughter bathed right across the river or close by? Did she know the schedule? How much calculation and how much risk was involved? And those are things that I will always wonder about. Going to verse 5. Now the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. While her young women walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her servant women, and she took it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby was crying. She took pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, Then Moses' sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. When the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." So the basket has made its way down the river or across the river, a different spot in the river where Pharaoh's daughter's bathing. And she picks up the basket, and lo and behold, there's a crying baby in this basket. And it says that she knew that it was a Hebrew child. My first question is, how did she know that this was a Hebrew child? They all lived in Egypt. They all had probably the same skin color, similar skin color. Moses would have been circumcised, so that would have been different than any of the other Egyptian babies, which is how she knew it was a Hebrew. And it says that she took pity on him. She felt compassion. And I think about Pharaoh in his darkness, in his evil ways, and killing all of these babies. His daughter had compassion. And then all of a sudden, Miriam, Moses' sister, she just happens to be there. She says, "Hey, hey, you found a baby. Should I get someone to go nurse the baby, to go take care of the baby?" And I've always wondered if Pharaoh's daughter had any suspicions, like, man, this is really a coincidence right here, that I have this baby, and now I have this little girl, and now I have someone to nurse, all within minutes of each other. Or I wonder if she was oblivious to all of it. So the woman took the child and nursed him. And then it says, when the child grew older, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So I don't know what older means. I don't know if older is the age that Moses stopped drinking milk. I don't know if older means 10 years old. I don't know if older means a teenager. I don't know. But I do know this, going to the next section of this passage, that Moses knew that he was a Hebrew. He knew his heritage. So either he figured that out as a child, or he had interaction with his parents all throughout his childhood and adulthood. We don't know. And then the last verse of this is, she named him Moses because she said, "I drew him out of the water." You ever wondered what Moses' real name was? What his first name was? What his real mother-given name was? We don't know. All we know is the Egyptian name that was given to him. And that gets us to verse 11. One day, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his people. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, behold, 2 Hebrews were struggling together, and he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" He answered, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you mean to kill me, as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely this thing is known. And then when Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and stayed in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So, we've gone from Moses being a baby to, at this point, Moses is 40 years old. So we've jumped way up, 40 years into the future. And something I like to think about is that Moses grew up as an Egyptian prince. Now, we don't have kings and queens and princes and princesses, but we have like the president of the United States. It would be like growing up as the grandchild of the president of the United States. And probably the best schools in the world at this time, the best education, probably the best food. They probably imported food from all over the world, the best clothing. When Hebrew children were playing handball, Moses was probably riding chariots or riding horses, or what rich kids do, I guess, is what Moses did. And that's how he grew up. And it says, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and looked on their burdens. He knew that he was a Hebrew. Sometimes people have what they call imposter syndrome. You do well in the interview and you get the job and you find out that you're not ready for the job, or you're not in the right place. I wonder how much Moses felt like an imposter. Like, I'm not supposed to be here. I'm supposed to be there with my people. Why do I get to experience, like I said, the rich kid life? And literally my people are being whipped and beaten and slaves. I wonder how much he felt like that. It says that he looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he struck down the Egyptian and hit him in the sand. Now, I've gotten in like fist fights before, and I've gotten in tussles, and like me and my friends have wrestled. But I've never been angry to a point to where I thought I could kill someone. Yet Moses in this moment, whether he hit him with a rock or pulled out a sword or a dagger or with his bare hands, I don't know, he killed this Egyptian. Have you ever done something wrong, and in the middle of it, you're afraid of getting caught, so you become more frantic and you move more quick, and you're trying to get this done so you don't get caught? I imagine Moses, digging a hole with his hands or with a shovel or whatever he had, and trying to throw this body into it, and as quick as he can cover up this body. And as soon as you can't see the body anymore, he stands up and he has a sigh of relief a little bit. He's looking around. Did anybody see me do this? And then it says, when he went out the next day, so at this point, maybe he thought that he's gotten away with it. He's gotten away with this killing. Two Hebrews were struggling together, and he said to the man in the wrong, "Why do you strike your companion?" He answered, "Who made you a prince and judge over us?" And then the words that Moses was dreading. "Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" You ever got caught doing something that you shouldn't do? And how there's just a pit in your stomach, and for me, I just want to run away. I don't want to deal with it. Now imagine you've been caught for murder or for killing someone, and your grandfather, who knows that you're this Hebrew that's been brought in to live as an Egyptian, might know this. And it says that he fled for his life, and he went to Midian. And that gets us to verses 16 through 22, which we're not going to read this morning. Basically, Moses gets to Midian, he's nice to some people, and he gets married. And that's pretty much what this passage says. Verse 23, During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. All right, so at this point, we have fast forwarded another 40 years. So what we're about to read, Moses is 80 years old. So in the first 3 chapters of Exodus, we go from little baby Moses all the way to old man, 80-year-old Moses. Chapter 3, starting in verse 1. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. You ever been at work, or just a regular Saturday, and you're out in the yard, and you're just having a day, like any other day, and then you see something's on fire, and you're like, man, I probably should go check that out, because something's on fire. And then you go over here, and there's a bush. I don't know, was it on campus at Freed Harbin, we have little bitty bushes, but we also have like big bushes, you know? I wonder how big the bush was, how big the fire was. Moses come over here and he's like, man, this bush is on fire, but it's not burning. It's still green. And in that moment, God calls out to him. The bush starts, if you have a bush talking to you, like I said, it's any other given day, and you have a bush talking to you, and it claims to be God, okay? I think I would probably believe the bush if a bush was talking to me that it was God. And it says, I'm God, you know. Verse 7, go with me to verse 7. Then the Lord said, I've surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to have a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression of which the Egyptians oppressed them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. So, God has this message for Moses. He says, hey, like I said, this is 40 years later. This is a lifetime ago that Moses lived in Egypt. And it was a lifetime before that, before Moses was even seen as a Hebrew. He was an Egyptian before that. And God says, I'm going to take you, and I'm going, through you, you're going to deliver the people of Israel out of Egypt. Here in a second, we're going to get into what Moses says to that, like his responses. But I want us to realize that for Moses, it would be like, imagine God coming to you and says, all right, I want you to be the president. You're going to be the president of the United States of America tomorrow, okay? But not only that, I want you to start a major conflict with Russia and China at the same time. Egypt is one of the strongest nations in the world at this time. And I could not imagine the idea of having to go against Egypt or to go against Pharaoh and knowing the power that they had. So we're going to jump around a little bit here because there's a lot of dialogue, but we're going to emphasize Moses' response. Going to verse 13. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. So Moses says, who am I saying sent me? And God says, let them know that I sent you. That I am who I am, the God has sent you. Going back to verse 11, it says, but Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children out of Egypt? He said, but I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. That's probably the excuse that I would have used. Like, who am I to be, like I said, to be the president of the United States, to start a major conflict with Russia and China at the same time? Who am I to lead this charge, to deliver these people out of Egypt? Going on to chapter 4, verse 1, it says, then Moses answered, but behold, they will not believe me or listen to my voice, for they will say, the Lord did not appear to you. The Lord said to him, what is that in your hand? He said, a staff. And he said, throw it on the ground. So he threw it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And Moses ran from it. I would run from it. But the Lord said to Moses, put out your hand and catch it by the tail. So he put out his hand and caught it by the tail, and it became a staff in his hand. So Moses says, it doesn't matter who sent me or who am I to go. They're not going to believe me. And God says, okay, well, we're going to throw your rod on the ground. It's become a snake. You're going to run from it. You're going to pick it up. And lastly, go with me to verse 10. Verse 10. But Moses said to the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant, but I am slow of speech and tongue. Then the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Who makes him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth and teach you what you shall speak. But he said, O my Lord, please send someone else. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know he can speak well. Behold, he is coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. So, lastly, Moses says, I'm not a good speaker. Maybe he had a speech impediment. Maybe he was slow to speak. We don't know. It's funny that he has this excuse twice. I'm not good at speaking, and God says, well, who made your mouth? Who made your tongue? Who made words? I got you. And then there's no more excuses. It says, but he said, oh my Lord, please send someone else. Like, come on, please. And then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. I've always wondered if the bush got a little hotter, or if the bush got a little bigger. The fire, That's all of Moses that we're going to talk about today. After this, Moses brings salvation. He delivers the people. He delivers 1 million people, at least 1 million people, out of the land of Egypt, out of one of the biggest superpowers of the world at that time. He does something great. And for us, as these people being our spiritual ancestors, they're part of our story. Moses brings our people, our forefathers, out of Egypt. And ultimately, Moses ministers to the Israelite people. Do you remember the question that I had at the beginning? What changes need to happen for us to be better ministers? What changes need to happen for us to be better ministers? Now, this story is very interesting to me because if I'm God, which I'm not, but if I'm God and I'm wanting to start a revolution and I'm wanting to deliver some people out of another country, I'm not picking the 80-year-old man. I'm not picking the lowly shepherd. I'm not picking someone that fled Egypt 40 years ago because he was charged with murder. I'm not picking someone that no one in Israel knows. Remember, he was an Egyptian. He was known as an Egyptian 40 years ago. And now no one even knows who Moses is. Honestly, that's probably the last person that I'm picking to deliver the people. If I'm picking, if I'm picking, not God, I'm probably going back around 40 years. There's a man who grew up in Pharaoh's household. He is angry to the point of killing an Egyptian. He is angry about the oppression of his people. He's fired up and he's ready to go. And I've asked myself, why did God wait? 40 years is a long time to wait when it seemed like it was ready to happen when Moses fled. And the conclusion that I've come up with is that God didn't want to use a man that felt adequate. He didn't want to use a man that felt ready. He didn't want to use a man that was fired up. He wanted to use a man that felt inadequate. To say, who am I? Who am I to do all of these things that you want me to do? Because in those moments, in our inadequacies, or at least I know in my inadequacies, that's when God's power is usually shown the most. That's when God really does his thing. That's when he really makes a difference. And so the question is, what changes need to happen for us to be better ministers? Maybe Moses was prideful. Maybe being like I said, I used the word rich kid, Maybe he had a lot of pride. Maybe he thought a lot of himself. He thought enough of himself to kill someone. Maybe he needed a little humbling. Maybe he needed a little lessening. And in God's case, that's when he chose to use him. So maybe there's some people here, including myself, that I need to lose some things. I need to lose how highly I think of myself, and I need to probably get off of my high horse, and I need to realize the talents that I have are not because I've honed them or because I've worked on them, but because of God. And maybe there's a few people here, including myself, that need to gain some things. Maybe I need to be more humble. Maybe I need to say, who am I to be your servant, to be your child? And we don't understand God's timing. I don't understand God's timing. But God waited 40 years after he left Egypt, after Moses left Egypt. God waited 40 years to have this conversation. And I don't know, maybe it took Moses 40 years to be where he needed to be. I hope it doesn't take me 40 years for me to be where I need to be, for me to be humble enough and to be the servant that I need to be. Something else that I thought about was Moses was 80 years old. 80 years old when he embarked on his greatest ministry, on his greatest challenge, on his greatest thing for God. It doesn't matter our circumstances or how old we are. Our greatest ministry could be right in front of us. It could be right around the corner. So, today, maybe there's someone here that needs to lose some things. Lose some opinions about themselves. Maybe lose some pride. Maybe there's some people that need to gain in humility to be able to say, who am I but just a lowly servant of God? And for us to say that's all he needs. All he needs is a lowly servant, and that's usually what he does his greatest things with. So, church, if there's anything you need, if you need prayers, if you need anything, please come as we stand and as we sing.